Good morning, everyone. This session, I will be talking about marine biodiversity in Indonesia, mostly on how Indonesia has such a remarkable high diversity in this region, and then the future prediction, what will happen in the next future, let's say the next 100 years or even 1,000 years, we don't know. We'll see. This is the overview of my talk, this session. The first is about the epicenter of marine biodiversity, that is Indonesia, partly, and then what process that generates the biodiversity. The third one is what is the current status, main threats, and management efforts. And the second main part is the management efforts, the future projection of the marine biodiversity. So, if we look at Indonesia in general and specifically on marine biodiversity, I think most of us already know that we are known as the epicenter of marine biodiversity. We can look at from reef corals, for example, more than 500 species of stony corals, zooxanthellate corals can be found in Indonesia. And in the coral triangle, the red one, you can see on the left side here that species richness in Indonesia or in the coral triangle reach a very high level. That's more than 500 species. And then another measure of diversity is phylogenetic diversity. That means how old is the species have been there. So again, Indonesia species, most of the coral species in Indonesia or coral triangle here are really old. More than 5,000 million years ago. So that's it's kind of the ancient population, the ancestral population of reef corals. But then here we have phylogenetic species variability. Phylogenetic species variability means it's a measure the relatedness of species of each among others. So the value range 0 to 1. That means 0 means each species, they have very similar relationship with each other. And if the value 1, that means among species, they don't have any connection. For example, endemic species, they don't have any relationship far relationship with other species. Here, Indonesia is like a medium level, 0.5. But here in Red Sea and then the Andaman Sea or the Philippines, around here, it's high phylogenetic species variability. That means a lot of endemic species. But we don't look at here in terms of the epicenter of marine biodiversity. What we look at here is species richness and phylogenetic diversity. Just to give you a context here, in the Atlantic Ocean, there are only about 100 species of reef corals. So the entire Atlantic Ocean, they only have hundreds of coral species. But this is a small part here, we got more than 500 species. Or in the Red Sea, 340 species. Western Indian Ocean is somewhere on here, almost 300 species. We see that again, these regions harbors corals, really high species richness in corals. Then we look at seagrass. This is map from Short et al. In 2007. very green, dark green here shows a species richness of seagrass range from 12 to 15. And most of the species here, Indonesia here, Philippines, somewhere in the east coast of Africa, and Australia, west coast, east coast of Australia, they have more than 12 species. Mostly Halophila seagrass. If you already know what seagrass is, I think you are familiar with Halophila, Cimodosia, Thalassia, and etc. Seagrass is kind of like grass that lives in the sea, but it's not rumput laut in Bahasa Indonesia, or it's not seaweed if you translate it in Bahasa Indonesia. It's really grass that lives in the sea. So this is the epicenter of seagrass diversity. Now we look at mangroves. Mangroves here, Indonesia, it has almost more than 3 million hectares of mangrove covers. And this is 22.6% of global mangrove area. About 50 mangrove species can be found in Indonesia, or coral triangle here. That makes Indonesia is the hotspot for marine biodiversity. Fish, for example, another example, fish. This is reef fish, for example. In Indonesia, in 2003, one of our colleagues, Pak Adrim, reviewed the species for reef fish, and they listed more than 2,000 species of reef fish in total in Indonesia here. To give you a context, here in the Indo-Pacific, reef fish species is about, recent estimates provides a higher number, but the pattern is still the same. A lot of species can be found in this area. This is species density, and this is functional group richness. Functional group richness means, fish, they are herbivores, fish carnivores, they are coral eaters, and etc. That's functional group richness. And again, this part is showing a high number of functional group richness. That high biodiversity, I think, naturally raises a question. What process that generated this high biodiversity? These are three main theories that try to explain this diversity, species diversity, for example, can be so high in this region. The first is center of origin, center of overlap, and center of accumulation. But before we going into detail of these theories, we need to understand what divergence or speciation is, and then the geological history of this island, of this archipelago, and then the oceanographic setting of this archipelago. We need to understand these three, and then we look at these three again for answering the main questions. Okay. Now this is about divergence or speciation. Well, this is not really into detail on speciation, because it would be a different session, I think, or another class, or one semester, or about speciation. But in general here, assume that you have two populations here. One in below and one above. And each population here, you have colorful populations. And each color represents genetic traits or uniqueness or characteristics of the population, for example. You have many colors here: blue, red, green, pink. Yeah, pink. And then red and many colors. The same as the population above. They have colorful population, and the pattern of the characteristic of the traits, they look the same. They have both. They both have red, blue. It's the same. What makes these two populations having homogeneous characteristic or genetic traits here is there are migration. So individuals move from above to below population, or from below population to the above populations. And while they move, there is a mixing in the genetic pool of the overall populations, because they are not only moving, but they mate with the member of the other populations, because they mate, they mate, and there is an exchange in the genetic pools. So there is a migration. At the same time, there is a mutation, change in a genetic code, and there is also genetic drift. What is genetic drift? Genetic drift is loss of genetic traits over time by nature. It's a stochastic event. So by chance, just getting lost. Because these two forces, mutation and genetic drift and migration, these three working together, and there is no barriers here, everyone can move freely from below to above or above to below. There's mixing, and the overall gene pool or genetic traits or characteristic of population, they are just the same. That means homogeneous. All right. So what happens when there is no migration? When there is no migration, that means there is a barrier that prevent movement of individuals among these populations. Because there is no movement, that means there is no gene exchange, there is no mating among individuals, among populations, and at the same time, there is mutation and genetic drift. There is the same again, mutation and genetic drift. Mutation will result in new traits. We see yellow traits here. And here there is brown traits because of mutation. And there is genetic drift. Genetic drift will result in loss of genetic trait. That means we lost, and here we lost, but maybe the dark blue here is getting increase in number. But the principle is the same. So here, because of barriers, there is no movement. Each of these populations move on its own way so that they are unique to each others. What is barriers here in real nature, in nature? This can be islands formation that prevents individual movement from one part of the seas to another part of the seas. Barriers can be ocean current. Ocean current like for example in the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, this is one direction. It's not bidirectional. It's only one direction from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. So for individuals that move passively via water current, they cannot move from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. That's the barrier for them. But the movement only from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. So there is only, migration is only one way. That means there is the sink population, the receiver of the movement, the migration, and the source of populations. Just keep that in mind, because we will need this understanding to move to the theory. Now, what happens if there is some of the individuals somehow move to another place, to new habitat, for example? Or maybe just there's a chance and a new habitat form, and some individuals got the chance to move to other place, new habitats, and then they colonize new habitats. Because these individuals, they only carry a subset of this the whole gene pool, because they cannot take all of these genetic traits, only a small subset. So this new population will only represent a subset of population from its ancestral populations. From this pattern, by looking at the traits, the genetic traits, any traits, morphological traits, it's easy to use genetic traits because it's in a simple way. Genetic traits here, by looking at the pattern of the genetic traits, you can see which population are the source, which population are the sink, or both are the same. Now the geological history of the Indonesia. First, we look at the island formation from 60 million years ago until today, until the recent time. 60 million years ago, there was no Indonesia here. What is now Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean, the connection between these two zones, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, are really large. Practically mixing of species in this time really large, high, because there is no barriers from this part to this part. But then about 50 million years ago, the initiation of Sunda self began. This one's the onset of Borneo, Kalimantan, and Sumatra here, and part of Papua. The onset of Papua is emerging. And then 5 million years ago, Sunda Shelf emerged, Sahul Shelf start to appear, and then some part in Philippines here, Java here, and until now, in the recent time, we have what we have now. The Indonesian archipelago here in recent time. What we see here is the emergence of barriers for migration. And then the second setting is the oceanographic settings. The major geological events during the last glacial maximum or during the Pleistocene. During the last glacial maximums, the sea level dropped 120 or about 120 lower than today's level. That leaves Sunda Shelf exposed. So Kalimantan or Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and Southeast Asia practically connected. Papua and Australia, Sahul Shelf, they are connected. And the connection between Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean are limited. Some believe that there is a water current that connects Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean, but still it is limited. It's not like what is happening as it is today. There are some ocean basins that acts as refugia. Refugia is a refuge for species to survive because, they cannot, like for example, corals. They cannot live here in Sunda Shelf. It's dry. It's a forest. So this is the geological history. You can compare the present day landmass configuration with today and about 100,000 years ago. And then the oceanographic setting. Some believe that the oceanographic setting during 15 million years ago until now, it's not really that different. Some believe of that, but there is a difference. I'm not going to talk in detail about the oceanographic setting, but it's because in general, the water current flows from Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean. That's the water current generally flows from that direction. The gray shaded area here is during the landmass configuration during the Pleistocene glaciations. We have North Equatorial Countercurrent, North Equatorial Current, Indonesian True Flow, Halmahera eddy, and like South Java Current, and this is the oceanographic setting for present day Indonesia. Now we talk about the center of origin. The main assumption for this theory is that the ancestral populations has the highest diversity, and it should be in the center of the archipelago, and this is here. This is just hypothetical figure. Let's say this is the center of the marine biodiversity somewhere in the eastern of Indonesia. Should be the highest biodiversity. This is the value. I'm using genetic diversity here, allelic diversity or heterozygosity index or whatever it is. And then from this area, there is subsequent dispersal that radiates to the peripheral population by migration. So here, the genetic diversity or the diversity is lower than the central part of the center here. What is important here in this theory is that ancestral population has the highest diversity, peripheral populations have lower diversity, and there is asymmetrical migration from the center towards the peripheral populations. This is center of origins. Because this is ancestral population, that should be, if you remember the previous slides about migration, divergence, ancestral populations always have higher diversity than the peripheral populations, because they have been there for a longer time than the other ones. Center of accumulation. Center of accumulation is, by contrast, is on the contrary with the center of origin. There are speciation on the peripheral populations. And again, this is hypothetical figure, so I just draw to make it easy. For example, we have 5 populations or clusters of populations. Western Australia, Sunda South, the Philippines, Eastern Indonesia, and Papua and east coast of Australia. These are the center, the peripheral populations. If you look at the migration pattern, it's always coming into the central populations. That leaves Eastern Indonesia has high diversity because it accumulates in this part. How? Because individuals, populations are migrating to this part. Again, asymmetrical migration, asymmetrical gene flow. Later, we'll see an example of 2 species. Center of overlap. Center of overlap is a bit similar with center of accumulation because the asymmetrical migration happen. Of here we can have 3 or 4 or 5, whatever you want to have. But here we have two populations or clusters of populations, but their distribution overlap each other. Let's say we have 2 here, we have 2 traits here, 2 genetic traits here, 2 genetic traits here. Because they overlap each other, of their distribution, then you have 4 here in the middle. That's the center of accumulation. But what is the difference between center of overlap with center of accumulation? center of overlap needs barriers of dispersals. And barriers of dispersals can be during the last glaciation, when the Sunda self-exposed, when the Sahul cells were exposed. After the last glacial maximum, when the sea level rise, then there is no barrier. Once population are disconnected from here to here, they meet and then they overlap here. That's the center of overlap theory. We can see from next example of a case study. Now, this case study 1 on Thalassia hembrichii. This is using genetic study. It's easy because, well, genetic study looks maybe practically difficult, but actually it's easy to understand. Okay, for the allelic richness or diversity, we see here population number 1, population number 2 is really high, and then the rest is lower. The same in the another measure of diversity. These are expected heterogeneity. This is a measure of diversity. Population number 1, 2, or 3, or Eastern Indonesia, they have a high diversity compared to the rest of the population. If you compare the west coast of Australia, then it's this lowest one, number 70. You can look at the migration pattern from these 3 clusters of populations. You can see the migration predominantly from the east to the west. And there is no migration from the west to the east. The question is, what process generates this pattern? Is it center of origin? Is it center of accumulation? Is it center of overlap? And how about the geological history or oceanography that you've seen before in the previous slide? How do these factors contribute to shape this pattern? Previously, Mbak Chidi mentioned about quiz, and this is the question. For one of you that can answer this.
Anyone can answer Mr. Udhi's question? Please raise your hand. Nobody? We have a very interesting prize for you.
If I answer the question, can I get prize?
We share.
Oh, we share. Okay. Okay. So it's incomplete study. So it's difficult to say whether this is exactly center of origin, exactly center of accumulation or overlap. Because if we say that this is center of accumulation, maybe we can say this is the accumulation zone, Sunda Clade. But then East Clade also moved to the Indian Ocean Clade. But there is no migration from the Indian Ocean Clade to the Sunda Clade. So this is not center of accumulation. Or maybe center of origin. Center of origin, that means the Eastern Indonesia act as the ancestral population. But then we need to do some samplings here. We need some samples from the Philippines or from Guam or from French Polynesia or somewhere in the Pacific. If the migration pattern moves from the eastern part of Indonesia to the east, that means center of origin here. But if not, if the other way around, like this part and from the east to the west, then it's a stepping stone. You know a stepping stone? You jump from one place to another place just following the water current. because seagrass cannot move, cannot like animals. They just passively disperse via water current. Now, from this pattern, what do you say about geological history or oceanography? Anyone dare to answer?
Thank you. My name Aida Sartimbal from Brawijaya University. Actually, I don't know exactly about this kind of science, but I just guess that maybe geological history or oceanography could be the best reason why there is moving from seagrass from East Clade to Sunda Clade or Indian Ocean Clade, because if we see from the beginning of geological history that Indonesian could be one island connected each other, and beside that we can know exactly about the current. For example, Indonesian through flow could be one reason for the moving of that seagrass.
Thank you. More or less, you got the general picture. Another analysis on statistical analysis, on which part of geological history and oceanography that contribute to shape the pattern here. And it is both. Both factors shape this pattern of population, and 20% and about 8%. What about the rest? This is about 30%. What about the 70% of the variation? 70% of the variation could be explained by migration, by mutation and genetic drift. Now, case study 2 for reef fish Cephalopolis argus. This is grouper, crapu, Cephalopolis argus. This is the pattern of the migration. I already highlight 4 parts here. French Polynesian, Indonesia, or Bali here, and French Polynesian to Central Western Pacific. And the number of migrants is the highest one, from east to west here. This is the pattern of the migration. And then, if we look at the other way, is there any migration from the west to the east? And the number is very low. Here, from Western Indian Ocean to the French Polynesian, it's 0. And this is 0.2. So, this is asymmetrical migration. Now, from the Western Pacific to Western Indian Ocean, and this is 0. There is no migration. So there is no migration from Pacific to Western India. But the other way around, from west to east, from Western Indian Ocean to Indonesia here to Central Western Pacific, there are a modest number of migration. So if you notice, the migration pattern is from the east to the west, from the west to the east. So the question is this center of origin, accumulation, overlap, or how about the geological history or oceanography? This is maybe accumulation or overlap. Because center of origin, no. Because the migration pattern here, it's always incoming. There is no outcome. There is no emigration. There is always immigration that coming into this region. That means accumulation or overlapping. How can we distinguish the accumulation or overlap? We need to know how old the population is. If these populations in here in French Polynesian or Western Indian Ocean is the oldest one, that means the overlap. But then again, it needs more samples. Somewhere it needs samples from here, it needs samples from Australia, so that we can have a clear picture of the migration pattern. History or oceanography. Geological history and oceanography, both, they act on the same result. Geological history, the emergence of Sunda Shelf, Sahul Shelf, it acts as a barrier for dispersal, so that population diverges on its own way. Then, when the sea level rose, two populations connect again, meet and overlap in this part. So we need to know the age of the population, to know the sink, to know which one is the sink, which one is the source. Okay, that's the answer for what process that generates the marine biodiversity in Indonesia. There are many questions actually, and it can be a topic for research, further research. I know some people in Indonesia, they do research on this topic. There are some universities, lecturers, or research centers as well that focus on what process that generate the marine biodiversity. Now, the current status. Sadly, this is one of the most threatened region in the world. This is for mangrove. Indonesia has lost 40% of its mangroves in the last 3 decades. 2015, so 3 years ago. 40% of its mangroves area is just lost in Indonesia. So, well, the highest part is here in the Pacific and Atlantic here. Seagrass status. Only 5% are in excellent conditions. This map is derived from the Walidata Lamun. I don't know in English, Walidata, guardians or repository data for seagrass in Indonesia. And the excellent part can be found in eastern Indonesia in Biak Numfor. And it's only 5% are in excellent conditions. For corals, again, only 5% or 6.2 are in excellent conditions. It's the data repository for corals and in Indonesia. And the best condition can be found in somewhere in the middle of here, in the middle of Pandasi, Lucifera Archipelago Islands. That's the most pristine, relatively pristine in Indonesia. And 92% are threatened. So yeah, that's the saddest part. That makes Indonesia is one of the global priorities for marine biodiversity conservation. The first is Australia, the second is Indonesia. That makes Indonesia is a hotspot for marine biodiversity. The term of hotspot doesn't mean only on high species number, but it also means high vulnerability. It's the most threatened region. Combine these two, threats and species richness, that makes a hotspot for marine biodiversity. Next. Main threats. I'm not going to talk more into detail about the main threats. Another session will be talking into detail about this one. But mostly it's about pollution, eutrophication, coastal development, destructive fishing, and global change, warming and more acidic oceans. Pollution and eutrophication. Pollution can be domestic sewage, plastics, marine debris, that's pollution. Eutrophication, fertilizers from agriculture, because enrichment of the nutrient that leaves eutrophication, and it can be bad for seagrass, it can be bad for corals as well. This one is the marine debris, microplastic, that one of our colleague will talk in the next sessions, Pak Reza. Destructive fishing. Destructive fishing includes bombings and cyanide, and yeah, well, in Indonesia it's widespread in many parts of Indonesia. The last is ocean warming and acidification, and it for corals it is bad. Warm ocean means bleaching for corals, so Santella expel from its host, that's bleaching, white. At first, when everything looks white, like snow, then it's look wow. But then the next few weeks, the next few months, then it's look bad. It is actually bad. Acidification, it will hamper the coral's capacity to calcification, for example. For seagrass, warm ocean will negatively impact on photosynthesis, for example, for seagrass. There are some limit for the heat tolerance for some seagrass species. Management efforts. I'm just going to quickly through all these slides. In the 70s, this was the first MPA established, that was in the Seribu Island. And then in 2008, Indonesia fulfilled its commitment in the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, and to create 2 million hectares of MPAs by 2010. And it reached. The new target is that 20 million hectares of MBAs by 2020. 2013, the total number of MBAs is 131, and the total areas is about 15 million hectares. About 2 weeks ago, I had a discussion with Mr. Andi Rosandi in our meeting with Andi Rosandi. He is the Director of Conservation and Marine Biodiversity from the Ministry of Marine Affairs, Marine and Fisheries. He said that at this time, as he was saying, 19 million hectares of MBAs are covered in Indonesia. So by 2020, it's almost very close to the target for the CBD. Now, if you look at the CBD statute, we can see that CBD 10 expect that 10% of the territorial waters are protected, and Indonesia has about 310 millions of territorial waters. 10%, that means 30 million hectares. So target in 2020, 20 millions, that leaves on about 6.5 millions territorial waters are protected. So Indonesia has yet to set a date, a target, to reach 10% of its territorial waters are protected. So this is the challenge. Now, to meet that challenge, there are questions. Is it large or small MBAs? Large MBAs, one big MBAs, or small MBAs, but there are many. If you look at the statistics here, Indonesia, most of the Indonesian MBAs are large MBAs, more than 100 kilometers square. About 60 something percent are large MBAs, more than 100 kilometers squares. And there are small portions are small MBAs. Which one are more effective? There are some research showing that this is not about being large or being small. It's actually what is the target for the conservation, for the protection. Some studies suggest that small MBAs can be very effective, but other studies suggest big MBAs, large MBAs can be the best one. It depends on which species of the conservation target, and it depends on the situation. Yeah. Again, Pak Andi Rusandi said that 50% of the Indonesia's MBAs are functionally meeting their management objective. And the challenge is how to improve the efficacy of the MBAs, marine protected areas, well designed and effectively managed MBAs, monitoring, integration of the community, and governance. And don't forget the funding. Now we will have 2 or 3 slides. Okay. Future projection. There is one I have mentioned about global change, warmer ocean and more acidic oceans, and it leads to, based on the modeling studies, it leads to local extinction and shift in distribution. Because the water is warmer, then species needs to find suitable habitat. They can go deeper. Or they move towards a colder water. That means going to poleward. So lot shift in distribution, local extinction. If the species, the speed of the movement for the species doesn't meet the speed of the change. They are just late. They are just too late. They are just slowly moving. That means they cannot survive, and local extinction. And this study is modeling studies, and it shows that the red one is average extinction, local extinction. The RCP, representative concentration pathways, the radiative forcing, the energy that the Earth received compared to the energy that the Earth radiates. RCP, this is the scenario. 2.6 is the lowest concentration, the lowest prediction, the scenario. Latitude, this is tropical zone, and local extinction is higher here than the invasion. This is the invasion. Invasion, the blue line, indicates shift in distribution because species move to new habitats that invade other habitats. And of course, because species move from this zone to poleward, that means invasion rate is high in the poles, in the high latitude, in a subtropical, in a pole areas, because this green. And then It's even worse in the RCP, the scenario RCP 8.5. The extinction rate, local extinction, is higher in the tropics, and the invasion rate index is higher in the higher latitude. So the tropics here in Indonesia, local extinction is predicted to happen in this region. Again, this is another studies and shows the same pattern. This is the decrease, local extinction again, decrease in species richness, up to hundreds of species lost. This is decrease in beta diversity, species richness again. Here, green. Indonesia is green. Green means it's not good because it lost more species here. About hundreds of species lost based on this prediction. And Coral Triangle suffers the most, or Indonesia suffers the most. This is because the speed of the change doesn't meet with the speed of the species to move. The speed of the change is faster than the speed of the species to move. So they cannot keep up. They cannot catch the speed of the change. Now, there is a question for how long this region, or Indonesia, Coral Triangle, remain the hotspot of marine biodiversity, the epicenter of marine biodiversity. It's actually natural to have hopping hotspot, you know. One time it's in another part of the ocean, another time it's in the other part on the other side of the ocean, and another time it's here in Indonesia. But the time scale is 40 million years ago. The epicenter of marine biodiversity is what is known as Mediterranean today. And then 20 million years ago, it was in the Middle East, what is now Middle East, because, well, 20 million years ago there was no Middle East. Today's Middle East. And the current time here in the Indo-Australian archipelago. Now, where is the next one? Is it going to be here, or how far from the future are we now? This is our questions together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Udhi, for your presentation.